Well, thank you for joining me again. I'm Gary Zacharias. This is the Apologist bookshelf. I would like to look at a book for the third time. I've done two previous podcasts. It's called Finding Truth by Nancy Pearcey. The subtitle is Five Principles for Unmasking Atheism, Secularism, and Other God Substitutes. So that's what the whole book is what are people replacing Christianity with? And how is that working out for people? So I'd like to go to the second principle that she's talking about here. It's called Identifying the Idol's Reductionism. So we'll get to that title in just a minute. But she says people go through what they call stupid years, where they walk away from God and try to substitute other things, and they end up really ruining their lives. And she said, listen to what Romans 1 says. It says there's a phrase that we hear several times in the first chapter. God gave them up, gave them up, gave them up. And she says that doesn't mean God gives up on people. It's just the opposite. He tries to get through to us by allowing us to play out negative consequences of idolatrous choices. And, I've got a talk that I'm doing to some of my Sunday morning classes. I just call it Some Good News. And here's what's going on. Our society has tried to walk away from God, but what's left are some pretty terrible choices. And so there's actually a rekindling of interest in spiritual things, especially Christianity. For example, this year, and this is a podcast I'm doing toward the end of 2024, there's been a tremendous uptick in the number of sales of Bibles, way higher than other books. It's not like all book sales are going up. Bible sales are going up like crazy. And one of the reasons they're kicking around is that we're in an age of anxiety and people don't have any solutions. And so I think God lets us go down the road of our own choices and says, okay, watch what happens, and then we come running back. And so we see that strategy throughout Scripture. The ancient Israelites turned to idols. God said, so I let them follow their own stubborn desires, living according to their own ideas. That's Psalm 81. In the Song of Moses, God says, this is Deuteronomy, I'll hide my face from them. I'll see what their end will be. So God basically is saying, okay, you want to have it your way? Then let's see how that turns out. And so are people going to continue worshiping a counterfeit God, or are they going to turn to God himself, back to God? So here we go, Principle 2. She calls it Identify the Idol's Reductionism. So the question comes up, why is it that when we follow idols, we inevitably end our lives in some really terrible behavior? What's the connection? And she says, here it is. The link is that idols, whatever you're replacing God and Christianity with, leads to a lower view of human life. And in Romans 1, she does a lot of Romans 1 here. Romans 1 says, look at that word exchange. That's Romans 1:23. They exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. So when a worldview gets rid of the Creator and substitutes something else, it gets rid of a high view of humans, made in God's image, for a lower view of humans, made in the image of something else in creation. So she's saying if we don't get our identity from a transcendent God, we're going to get it somewhere else in creation. We're going to look around and get it from God. She said every concept of humanity is created in the image of some God, but that divinity is going to be lower than the biblical God, so guess what? The view of humanity is lowered as well. And so she says in philosophical terms, this is called reductionism, and that means reducing something from a higher, more complex level of reality to a lower, simpler, less complex level. So Principle 1, she said, going back to her first part of her book, gave us the first step in engaging any non-biblical worldview, and that's identifying its idol. In other words, what is put in place of God. Now she goes to Principle 2. Okay, now that you figure out what the idol is, identify its reductionism. She said, when God gives people up to their idols, people walk away from God, come up with an idol, the result is always a lower view of humanity, and that unleashes all sorts of destructive behavior. If we reduce people to anything less than fully human, we're going to treat them as less than fully human. Isn't that a good sentence? Yeah, I like that idea. I don't like the idea, but I like the way she's put it. If you reduce people to something less than fully human, we're going to treat them as less than fully human. She said, when we define God as a something instead of a someone, we tend to treat people as somethings too. So she said, why don't we start on a personal level, try to figure out how this reductionism works. She said, think about the idols that we live for. Do we live for financial success? Is that our number one goal? If so, we evaluate every activity by how it pays off economically. So you look at people, for example, and you say, are they going to be useful to help me make my economic advancements? So your outlook in life is going to be one-dimensional, or it's utilitarian. So she said, maybe it's relationships that are most important to you, or your physical appearance, or your accomplishments. She said, we always measure every part of our life by whatever that yardstick is. So an idol always leads to a reductionist attitude. It dehumanizes others, and they all have to be used for our own agenda. So that's really sad, but it's really true, I think. She said a non-biblical worldview is going to have no logical basis for altruistic behavior, for helping other people. And she said in evangelism, we all want to evangelize. So it can be effective, she said, to walk people through the implications of their worldview, to show people that it doesn't provide any basis for highest moral and humanitarian ideals. I do a talk about tactics when it comes to apologetics, and one of the tactics is, I call it take it to the limits. And so we can take a reductionist view and show how it really lowers our view of the human race. So I can cover that another time. She said, now, when we dehumanize people, what's the result? We're going to mistreat them, oppress them, abuse them. We're going to exploit them in our actions. Sad but true, huh? So when a person accepts materialism as a life philosophy, the effects of it are not going to stay just in our heads. We're going to act it out. We're going to have destructive personal behavior, maybe something harmful in the public. So her point is, whatever your worldview is, how do we see other people? It's going to affect how you treat others. Now, she said, Paul says people suppress the truth in Romans 1:18. She said that's what reductionism accomplishes. It denies or it suppresses the truth about some part of human nature, so that the evidence from human nature doesn't point as clearly to the biblical God. So she said, in a sense, she said, we're trying to stuff reality into a box to get it away from God, but the box is always too small. She said, whatever doesn't fit in the box is going to get tossed. Okay, so she said, we've got this suppression, though, that causes this deep chasm. It's in theory, but she said it's always in practice. So on one side of this chasm are things that fit in the box that we say are real and objective. But on the other side are the things that stick out of the box that are reduced to illusions or mental constructs. And so she goes back to Francis Schaeffer to get this idea fleshed out a little bit. Think of two stories in a building. Reductionists live in only one story. So, for example, she says, let's take a materialist. That person lives strictly in the lower story. That's the material universe. So matter and energy are the only things that are real, only things that are true, only things that are knowable. But the upper story is kind of an attic where they toss everything that doesn't fit into that box. So what doesn't fit into the materialist box? Things like soul, spirit, mind, morality, freedom, love, and God. She said, you might think these things are stashed away in the attic in a dusty old trunk that you'd call superstition. And she said, because people are made in God's image, though, we can't live in a single story, so that we can't live totally in that material world. She said, before she goes on and illustrates that, she said, there are so many forms of reductionism. And so she said, let's recognize them. So she said, here are two of the most popular ones, I guess, materialism and postmodernism. And she said, and you see it also in two religions, and she says pantheism and Islam. So that's where she's going for the rest of this chapter. So she said, let's look at materialism first. That's the claim that all of our thoughts and our convictions and our desires are fictions. It's our brain chemistry that's doing that. Because after all, if you're a materialist, we don't have a soul, we just have a brain. She said, and people will say, well, consciousness is an illusion. You just think that you're thinking, right? It's your brain doing it all. She said, but if consciousness is an illusion, Why would we trust the thinking of scientists who tell us there's no such thing as thinking? In other words, it's self-refuting. She said that radical reductionism is held by several leading thinkers. Here's one, Francis Crick, the one that helped crack DNA code. He said there's no soul. Here's what he said. You, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. He concludes, you're nothing but a pack of neurons. Okay, that's Francis Crick. That's materialism. Another man in Harvard, David Wagner, says free will is an illusion. It's just unconscious physical causes. And it says that strikes most people pretty extreme to claim we don't have any free will. How could you come up with something that's so contrary to our normal experiences? Why are we conscious? So she said materialists are not really happy with this outcome that rejects anything beyond the material realm. So they said, okay, we are conscious beings. It had to come out of matter. It's called emergentism. Okay, in other words, how do we become conscious? Somehow matter got more and more complicated, and bingo, someday we woke up and said, hey, we're thinking beings. But it said the claim that mental properties came out of brain states is hugely implausible. Mental states are nothing like a physical state. You know, a physical object like a rose could be red, could be prickly, but your thought about the rose isn't red. It's not prickly. Physical objects are public. You can observe them with other people. They can come in and look at your chair. They can watch your TV. But mental states, like what you're thinking about, a feeling of joy or pain, that's private. You have to explain what you're thinking to other people. Nobody else can see it, even if they've got you hooked up to electrodes attached to your brain. So mental states are always about something, directed toward an object. But physical objects are not about anything. They just are. Right? My car. It's just there. That's a physical object. But I can think about the car. I can wonder if I've changed the oil. I can wonder if it needs gas, things like that. So it seems like, she says, that consciousness and matter are very different things. Yeah, I think so too. She quotes one philosopher, I like this, Galen Strawson, says the denial of consciousness is surely the strangest thing that's ever happened in the whole history of human thought. Yeah. Says facts that are suppressed by materialism are the things that people care most about, the conscious experience they're having. I mean, think about all of our experiences that make us happy with living. Things like love and fulfillment and moral ideals, a sense of purpose, and on and on. Those are experiences. Those are not material things. So here's the problem. She says, if elites see materialism, that means we reduce humans to computers. You know, we're just computers made out of meat. Then people are going to get treated like computers. We'll be judged just by how well we perform our assigned functions. And when we stop functioning, what do we do with the computer? Get tossed in the garbage heap. That's pretty scary, huh? Then she says there's postmodernism going on. Okay, so a lot of professors really buy into this, but it's also dehumanizing reductionism. So she just covered materialism. Now she looks at postmodernism. She said it goes back to the Romantics. They thought that there was a transcendental ego or some kind of universal mind that created the world of experience. And that led to pantheism, as you can tell. The Romantics wanted to overthrow the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment saw the universe as a big machine. They wanted instead it to be organic. The universe was an organism. So the Romantics wanted to get rid of materialism, that just reality is material. So they proposed the idol of what they call idealism, that the ultimate reality is mental. Novelist Walker Pearcey, she quotes, says materialism stuffs everything into the box of things. Idealism stuffs everything into the mind box. And so she goes back to that 2-story building that she talked about. This is Schaeffer again, Francis Schaeffer. She said, we have 2 philosophical families. Bottom floor is the Enlightenment. That's the box of things. So you look around and you see the stars and all that kind of stuff. But the upper story, Romanticism, is the box of mind. Right? So, what is important is what's going on in your head. And she said the Romantics revived Neoplatonism. The idea of idealism had roots in the 3rd century. So it was kind of the New Age movement in the ancient world. So the whole idea of Neoplatonism is that the world is an emanation of a spiritual substance they call the One, or the Absolute. So we want to, as humans, their view is we got to escape from matter. We want to reunite with this One, this pantheistic idea. Nature is permeated, they said, by a soul or spirit. Ralph Waldo Emerson called it the oversoul. So Neoplatonism then got a twist thanks to Hegel. He had the idea of historical development or evolution. Now, he also had a pantheistic deity. It was called for him the absolute spirit or universal mind. And it evolved, he said, along with the world. So Hegel was offering, in a sense, a spiritualized version of evolution. And he applied the concept of evolution not to biology like Darwin did, but to the world of ideas. And so his philosophy, they say, is a form of what's called historicism, the idea that all ideas are produced as products of historical forces. Well, what's the problem with historicism? It's self-refuting. The claim that every idea is a partial or relative truth has to include its own claim. So it's relative to its own moment in history, and therefore it's not true in any trans-historical sense. It said, you can't maintain as a timeless philosophical truth that there are no timeless philosophical truths. Yeah. Said Hegel avoided this conclusion only by tacitly making an exception for himself. That's kind of funny. He wrote as though he alone was mysteriously able to rise above the evolutionary process. He was the only one that could be objective and look around and see the whole historical process. Okay. So how do we get around to postmodernism? So said you see it often in political correctness, things like multiculturalism, identity politics, speech codes. Politically correct speech has become big in a lot of schools. So the pantheism, she said, was secularized eventually, and it became a metaphor. It became just a thought of the spirit of the age, sometimes called zeitgeist. And so pretty soon, she said, we've been led down this path that everybody's ideas are just social constructs, just stitched together by cultural forces. So postmodernism absolutizes the forces of culture and community. That's what gives us our ideas. She said our postmodern theological makes a claim in these words. There's no absolute truth. Truth is relative to the community in which we participate. You got that? Well, of course, that's self-refuting as well, isn't it? There is no absolute truth, but that person just made an absolute truth statement, if that's what he or she says. So she said, like other forms of knowledge, according to the postmodernists, science is a social construction. So postmodernists have made fun of the Enlightenment idea of neutral, timeless, value-free knowledge. They don't see it that way. So they make a claim there's no extra mental truth. All truth claims are social constructions. So the idea is people don't carry ideas around because they have good reasons to, but because they're black or they're white, they're a man, they're a woman, they're Hispanic, they're Asian, or whatever. She said, boy, is that dehumanizing it. You've lost your individual identity. You're part of group identity. And aren't we hearing that a lot today with critical race theory? Said, for example, many universities, you have liberal arts departments now that don't teach classics, but they immerse students in contemporary works on racial and sexual politics. So she says materialism is reducing people to physical forces. Postmodernism reduces them to products of social forces. Yeah. She says, on the other hand, Christianity offers a transcendent truth, a perspective that is not bound by the spirit of the age. It liberates individuals to think about what's going on. Okay, well, this is, I don't know how much more to go on this. I'm going to go a couple more pages, I think. She said, what do we do when we're talking to people who aren't persuaded by facts or reason? You know, that's where we are with postmodernism. But she said, start with their view of the truth. Postmodernists reject any claim to any kind of universal truth or objective truth. They say that everybody's perspective is situated. But see, that's a problem with their own claims. They too are situated. So how can they say that's true for everybody when they say they're stuck in their own culture? said they're just as exclusive as anybody else that says their view is the way things really are. So they poo-poo other people and say, oh, you think you have the truth. And she said, well, you do too. She said, objective truth is possible only if the Creator has spoken to the human race and given us his eternal, transcendental perspective. So only if God has communicated, reaching down to us, is it possible to break free, not to be trapped in our minds, or to be trapped in a communal mind like the postmodernists say. Well, I'm going to stop there. I'm still about halfway through a chapter. She's going to talk about pantheism next, but I'm going to hold off on that because there's a lot to chew on in this book, isn't there? I mean, Nancy Pearcey is not a quick read, but she is a challenging read, and I think sometimes we need to stretch ourselves a little bit. So she does that for us. Nancy Pearcey, a wonderful writer, a lot of good books that she's got out. Okay, well, I thank you so much for being part of this podcast, and talk to you later.